What happened to politics, you might be asking yourself? I remember when there used to be political parties that at least pretended to care about ordinary working people, no matter what colour they were or what their persuasions were. They represented people on the basis of economics. If you were the little guy, if you were an ordinary American, an ordinary Brit, or an ordinary Australian or whatever, there was a party for you. Where did those parties go to? What happened to the left? Where did the left disappear to? In this fantastic conversation from my podcast, Under the Skin, available on Luminary, you can get it on Apple, I talked to Jonathan Haidt, who's an expert on these matters, a brilliant thinker. You'll know all about him by now. You don't need me to tell you about his credentials. Look at this fantastic conversation where he talked about the erosion of those principles and how we ended up in a state where no matter who you work for, unless you're a big business, you probably aren't going to get a government that cares about you.
So it's kind of stunning that in the United States and in the UK, the Democratic Party and the Labour Party, of course, were there for the working man. They were focused on class issues. My grandparents, one of my grandfathers was a labor organizer in New York, in the shoemakers lobby or whatever it was. And so, from the 19th century and the writings of Karl Marx through the 1950s or up to the 60s, the left was focused on labor versus capital, class issues, the working class, and that was the bread and butter of the party's support. And then the left is kind of on the outs, both with Thatcher and Reagan are very successful in our two countries, and then center left politicians, Clinton and Blair, kind of reinvent their parties in a more, I don't usually use the word neoliberal, but I suppose it is appropriate here. They reinvent them in that way, and in part, they're capitalizing on the big switch from the economic left to the sort of the cultural left or the new left in the 1960s and 70s. I don't know about the history in the UK, but certainly in the US, we had the civil rights movement beginning really in the 50s and spectacularly successful in the 60s. We then get women's rights, gay rights, animal rights, gay marriage, LGBT, transgender. So we've had a real liberation. I mean, it is clearly the left fighting for liberation from oppression, but I think they kind of took a wrong turn as they got so focused on, quote, marginalized groups. They began to engage in a lot of symbolic politics, still using a kind of a Marxist or Foucaultian sort of language. And so now it's about things that really turn people off. Like in the United States, for a while, it was all about bathrooms and who gets to use which bathrooms. When all the while inequality is rising and the working class is doing terribly. So so the left has always been recognizably about power, but I think they kind of took their eye off the ball. Obviously, civil rights, women's rights, huge successes. But, our countries are now a lot more fair and open, but the left is sort of doubling down on these identity issues. And they, in fact, don't even like, certainly not the white working class, because they think the white working class is racist.
Do you see a corollary between the doubling down on these issues and the migration through politicians such as Blair and Clinton to a kind of a neoliberal left that still has the same economic interests and represents the same hegemony that has traditionally been represented by the right? So it's not a wrong turn. It's just it becomes a kind of, and obviously not diminishing the significance of something as powerful and profound as the civil rights movements, the rise of feminism or trans movements. Of course, I'm not. But I'm minded, Jonathan, of something that the gay rights activist Peter Tatchell said to me once. When he was campaigning for gay rights in sort of like African countries, I think specifically Rwanda or whatever, and sort of globally too. He said that the establishment will ultimately always yield on civil rights issues because it does not affect the nucleus of their power, which is financial and economic. If you start to approach that power basis, that nucleus of power, they will resist it. And sort of, when I consider the cultural wars and where it takes place, the conflict it causes between, let's say, the conventional constituency of leftist parties, i.e., white working class or white people or people of that class of all colours, and the emergent identity groups whose rights necessarily are being promoted, of course. But this is where true alliances ought to be taking place, because the powerful remain ultimately unaffected by these transitions, whereas there's this sort of layer of society where all this sort of frankly needless conflict.
Oh, that's interesting. We just had Martin Luther King Day here, and I was, listening to listening to his speeches and just thinking back on him. And at some point, I think it was he who said something about how the granting of civil rights and voting rights was the easy part because that doesn't really cost anything. The next phase is going to be economic. It's going to take billions of dollars, and this is going to be much harder. And that is the part that we're still wrestling with today, and the Biden administration is clearly very focused on. So I think there is something to the perspective that you give there. I would add to it, you have to look at coalitions on both sides. So the worst number of political parties to have in any country is 1, but the second worst number is 2, because that really creates, that maximizes the degree to which we do us versus them. Parliamentary systems have their own problems with stability, but they, if there's a bunch of different parties, you have to make coalitions. It's not just the world divided evenly in 2. So, on the right, Reagan created this coalition that seems a little unnatural, but had something in common, which was the evangelicals and the religious right, sort of nationalists and far right, more authoritarians, and what are sometimes called economic conservatives or laissez-faire conservatives, who are not conservative at all. They're what you call in Europe liberals, or what we call libertarians. So the right has those coalitions. So you can't say like the right has this agenda because there's these 3 different groups. On the left, I think we have at least 2 groups. We have the sort of the center left, Bill Clinton. I would put myself largely there. That is not anti-business. That generally is pro-business, but we, trying to make it better for the working class. But and then you have more the cultural left, which is especially in creative industries, in Hollywood, in universities, which is focused on identity issues. So if we have that map. Tell me your question again, and we'll put it in terms of like the 2 different groups on the left.
What I'd say is absolutely nowhere on that map is there a group that's saying if we are to make any meaningful impact on power, we have to concentrate on the regulation, taxation, dismantling, and in some cases nationalization of these extremely powerful groups in media, whether that's new or old media, in energy production, obviously sort of, I call them traditional energy. And I think that this dearth of representation for that particular specific, and I would say defining problem, is what is exacerbating this conflict. That the natural constituents of that territory have to reach to populism on the right, as it's the only thing that's in any way representing their values. Come on, your ancestors died in a war. This is our flag, in both of our countries. So that's where I feel the real problem might lay. And also, may I say, when you said the worst number of parties is 1, the second worst number is 2, and like a coalition government, it seems to me that the sort of, and without getting too much into, I don't even consider it conspiratorial territory, it's quite clear that there are global interests that are transcendent of national bipartisan politics, that are able to maintain their interests, pay money to, lobby with either party in either of our countries, and are, broadly speaking, free from any threat of their imperatives being pursued. And so like those 2 things, no representation to tackle that problem, and the reality of that problem is creating a new constituency with no home.
Yes, I think that's a good diagnosis. In the United States, we at least had Bernie Sanders, who was more of a old-fashioned economic socialism, very much more the worldview of my grandparents in New York City, so there certainly are still a very large group on the left that is focused on power and dismantling, but because they're focused on identity, it's about white supremacy or white privilege, and so they do want to dismantle, but it's not the powerful interests you're talking about, it's white people and especially straight white men. Those are the bad guys. And if we all focus on taking down straight white men, then the world will be a more just place. Now, this is an ideology that tends to be strongest, or I think is rooted in the universities and the elite universities in the United States. And we see, I think, evidence of it in Oxford and Cambridge as well. People who graduate from Harvard and Yale tend not to be Marxists who want to burn down the economic system. They want jobs in consulting companies, but they also want to rail against white supremacy, which has a very expanded definition. It used to mean like Ku Klux Klan, you think white people are superior and should run the place. Now it's if there's a racial imbalance, it's white supremacy. If the leadership of a university, if the top 3 people are white, that's white supremacy. So we have this enormous amount of concept creep, which then turns most of the country against them. So I do think this was a wrong turn for the left, or rather the left has weakened itself by embracing identity issues as firmly as it has.
If you enjoyed that conversation and you found it educational, you might want to consider subscribing to my podcast, Luminary. You can get it on Apple. I have a chat like that every single week, plus I do a guided meditation, plus Dave Chappelle's stuff's on there as well, which is mind-blowing and fantastic and brilliant. I love it. If you want to ask me any questions, comment below. We read these comments. We get into this stuff. Please subscribe to my channel and go over to Awakening for more free content. If you want to learn something about meditation, maybe have a look at that little video. If you want to learn a little more about corruption and politics, have a look at this little video. It's up to you. Thank you very much for watching.